here's something that simply shouldn't have been possible. On a perfectly ordinary Friday morning, a royal guard stationed at Clarence House flagged a vehicle that had no business being there. A black car, unscheduled, unannounced, sitting near the private entrance with zero record in the security system. And what he discovered locked inside the boot of that vehicle triggered a confrontation between Prince William and Camilla's own son, one neither man could ever take back. The items were secured within minutes. The exchange that followed lasted under 10 minutes. But the questions it raised haven't gone away, and here's why. Because the real issue was never what was inside that case. It was how it got there. And beyond that, how long it had been making its way toward that particular morning before anyone thought to look. That's what we're getting into today. And I'll tell you right now, this is one of those stories that ends nowhere close to where it starts. If you follow this channel and haven't subscribed yet, do that now, because what comes next genuinely reframes everything you thought you understood about this family. But that courtyard confrontation only makes sense once you trace it back several months, to a quiet dinner, one offhand question, and a gap in a palace records log that was never supposed to be noticed. We'll get there. Let's begin with the morning itself, because the way this thing surfaced tells you almost everything. It had started like any other Friday at Clarence House, the kind of morning that gives no warning, staff moving through their routines, a light breeze crossing the courtyard, and then, just before mid-morning, that black car rolled in near the private entrance, unscheduled, unannounced, no prior clearance anywhere in the security system. And this is where one man's instincts shifted the entire trajectory of this story. Because the guard who flagged it, Sergeant Whitmore, had served with the royal household for over a decade. And I want you to really sit with what that means, because it's the hinge the whole thing turns on. A man in that position knows the plates of every car that passes through regularly. He knows what a vehicle looks like when it's carrying nothing unusual. And within seconds of walking a slow circle around this one, he knew something wasn't right. The boot sat lower than it should have. Not dramatically, just enough. The kind of detail a less seasoned officer might have noted and moved past. But Whitmore didn't move past it. He called another guard over quietly. No urgency in his voice. Just that flat, measured tone of a man who has learned that the moment you show urgency in a palace courtyard, you've already altered the atmosphere. And the nearby staff started to slow without quite knowing why. The courtyard that had been moving at its usual pace seemed almost to hold its breath. Inside, none of this had reached Tom Parker Bowles yet. And that detail matters, because it tells you he wasn't watching the courtyard. He wasn't managing anything. He was sitting with his mother in her private drawing room, talking about food, a chef he'd recently spent time with in Paris, some unusual technique that had made him laugh. Camilla was leaning in, listening. These visits were rare enough to genuinely matter to her. Because Tom had never been a working royal. He'd built his life with clear and deliberate distance from all of this. His own career, his own family, his own identity. He came to see his mother the way a son comes to see his mother, not as a figure attached to an institution, but as someone he loved. Hold on to that, because it's what makes everything that follows so painful. So Whitmore knocks softly on the car window. Gets nothing. Then he steps inside and asks to speak with the visitor. Tom comes out into the courtyard with the mild irritation of someone who thinks this is a formality. He was wrong about that. Completely wrong, and you can almost see the exact moment he realizes it. Because when the guard points to the boot and explains that a routine check is required, Tom's whole expression shifts. He says the case inside is personal, private, books and papers, nothing more. He'd rather it not be opened. And here's the problem with that, and it's worth being direct about. Inside the royal household, personal preference is not protocol. Whitmore held his ground. He didn't escalate. He didn't back down. He held. And by the time Camilla stepped outside, a small audience had formed. Not a crowd, but enough. People who worked in that building and understood, simply from the shape of the scene, that something had moved outside the ordinary. She asked what was happening, and by all accounts her voice carried a sharpness it didn't usually carry. Whitmore explained, calmly, respectfully, without retreating an inch. And then, the moment the whole thing tips, a second car entered the courtyard, and Prince William stepped out. Now, whether that was coincidence, or whether someone had already made a call, we'll come back to, because it matters more than it first appears. But watch what happens the second he appears. The guards straighten, Tom's jaw tightens. Camilla goes very still, and William takes it all in, the locked case, the guards, his stepmother, her son, and he doesn't say a word. He just reads the room. And then he gives one instruction: clear, quiet, non-negotiable. Open the boot. And what was inside stopped everyone who saw it from making a sound. And notice how completely the story has flipped on itself. Because think about what the guard believed he'd found. He was working a security problem, an unregistered vehicle, a boot riding low. The kind of thing that in his mind could mean almost anything. He did his job exactly right. He flagged it, held his ground, reported it up the chain. And what he had actually uncovered was nothing his training could have prepared him for. Not a security breach in any conventional sense, but a wound stretching 30 years back into the very heart of the family he was paid to protect. And that, honestly, is the thing about this whole story. Everyone who touches it believes they're dealing with one kind of problem, right up until the moment it becomes an entirely different one. So let's talk about what was actually in that case, because this is where the story stops being about security and becomes something else entirely. William didn't speak on the drive back to Kensington Palace. His aide in the front seat understood enough not to fill the silence. The case sat secured in his boot, the same case that less than an hour earlier had been in Tom Parker Bowles's car with no explanation. William had already given his instructions in the courtyard. The case would be transferred. No copies made. No further questions asked in public. Whatever came next would happen behind a closed door. He carried it in himself. He asked his staff to leave, all of them. And the sitting room went quiet in the way a room only goes quiet when the person left inside it is holding something too heavy to put down. He set the case on the table, sat across from it for a long moment, and then he opened it. And here's what was inside: stacked pages, layered neatly, wrapped in tissue, bound with care, leather-bound diaries beneath them, covers worn soft with age, and at the very bottom, 2 sealed envelopes, each marked in the same hand. And this is the moment the whole thing detonates quietly, in a room with one person in it. Because William had recognized that handwriting the instant the boot opened in the courtyard. And now, in the silence, with no one watching, he recognized it again. The bold curves, the quick, slightly slanted letters, the way certain words pressed harder into the page, as if the person writing them needed the paper to hold what they were saying. His mother wrote like that when something mattered. These were Diana's letters, her private diaries, her own words in her own hand, locked away since 1997. Stop and think about what that actually means, because it reframes the entire courtyard scene. This wasn't contraband. This wasn't money or contracts or anything you could put a clean label on. This was the private interior voice of William's dead mother, sitting in the boot of his stepmother's son's car on an ordinary Friday morning, with no explanation. And he'd had to open it in front of Camilla and Tom to find that out. Imagine the whiplash of that. You're expecting a security problem, and instead you're looking at the handwriting of the woman you lost when you were 15. And what he read alone that night is the emotional core of everything. He lifted the first letter carefully. The date placed it in 1995, a year he understood, without being told, had been one of the most painful of her life. And the words weren't formal. They weren't written for an audience or an archive. They were the words of a woman writing to herself, the way people write when they truly believe no one else will ever read it. She wrote about feeling watched, about phone calls that felt listened to, about a marriage that had ended in every meaningful sense long before the world was told, about a loneliness that lived in rooms full of people. And here's the part that stopped William, and honestly, it's the part that stopped me too. She wrote about Camilla, but not with rage, not with the anger he might have expected, or maybe even hoped for, because anger would have been simpler. She wrote about her with the quiet exhaustion of someone who had long since stopped fighting something and simply started recording it instead. And I want you to stay in that moment with him for a second, because it's almost unbearable when you actually think about it. This is a man who has spent his entire adult life being the composed one, the steady one, the future king who doesn't let the mask slip in public. And here he is, alone at night, holding pages his mother wrote believing no one would ever read them. Reading her describe a loneliness he was too young to fully understand when she was alive. And the woman she writes about, exhausted, resigned, is his own stepmother. The woman who now sits at the center of his family. There is no clean feeling available to him in that room. Grief, anger, betrayal, love, all tangled into the same knot, and none of them can be acted on cleanly, because every thread runs straight through his father, so he doesn't react. He just reads. And that, I think, tells you everything about how the next 6 weeks were going to go. And then he picked up the diary. He didn't read far. A few pages in, he stopped. An entry from the months before the accident. The handwriting here was faster, more urgent. She wrote about meetings that were never officially recorded, about people she didn't fully name. And at the bottom of the page, almost as an afterthought, or perhaps the exact opposite of an afterthought, a single sentence, underlined once: "If anything happens to me, it will not be an accident." And William closed the diary. He did not open it again that night. He sat in the lamplight until the room outside his window went dark, and none of them, not Camilla, not Tom, not the advisors being quietly assembled, understood yet how far back this thing actually reached. So let's go back, because to understand how Diana's private letters ended up in the boot of a car on a normal Friday, you have to rewind about 6 months. And here's what I find so telling. It doesn't start with a confrontation. It doesn't start with a decision made in anger. It starts with a dinner. Quiet, private. The kind that leaves no official record, because it was never meant to be official. Camilla had gathered her children at a private address. Tom and Laura, both of whom had spent years building lives at a deliberate distance from palace business. Good food, easy conversation. And at some point in the evening, Camilla mentioned, in the way people mention things they consider completely settled, that the royal archivists were in the middle of a major cataloging project. Personal correspondence and private papers belonging to Diana. Items held in storage since 1997, being formally reviewed and logged for the first time. Purely administrative, she said. A long overdue tidying of the record. And Tom asked one question, a small one, the kind that sounds like casual curiosity, and sometimes genuinely is. He wanted to know what would happen to the letters once they were logged, whether they'd stay sealed, whether anyone outside the archival team would have access. And Camilla's answer was brief. The items would be stored securely, they would not be made public, and she moved the conversation on. The evening continued. Now, on its own, that's nothing. A son asking an idle question at dinner, but keep it in your pocket, because in a story like this, the small questions are never as idle as they look. 3 weeks later, a member of the Clarence House household staff was quietly reassigned. And I know how that sounds. Like nothing. Reassignments happen constantly inside royal households. Staff move between roles, between residences, between departments, for reasons that are rarely explained, and even more rarely questioned. It's a structural feature of palace life. And honestly, it creates, entirely by design, a kind of built-in institutional fog. Things change, people move, the household just continues. But here's what made this particular reassignment matter, and nobody flagged it at the time. Think about the role this person held. They were responsible for coordinating access requests to the archival review, scheduling visits, logging checkouts, making sure every item that left the collection was recorded and every item that came back was matched against the original log. And when they were reassigned, the role was not immediately filled. There was a gap, 11 days, according to sources familiar with the internal timeline, during which the formal oversight of the archival access process had no dedicated coordinator at all. Requests were still being processed, items were still being checked out, but the one person whose job it was to catch inconsistencies was no longer there to catch them. And here's what that access log would later show, once someone finally reviewed it. Something that should have triggered an automatic flag, and didn't. An item checked out under a valid standing authorization code, cataloged simply as personal correspondence, miscellaneous, pre-2000. No return entry filed, no follow-up initiated, and nobody noticed, because the code was legitimate. The process had been followed. On paper, everything looked exactly the way everything was supposed to look, and I want you to really sit with that, because it's the whole mechanism of this story. This is precisely how the most consequential things get moved, not through dramatic theft, not through broken locks or forced entry, through a gap that exists for 11 days in an administrative process, and a code that nobody thought to question because it had always been valid before. That's it. That's the whole trick. Now let's talk about what happened when they actually questioned Tom, because his answer, or really his non-answer, is one of the most important moments in the entire thing. The formal questioning took place that same afternoon, after the courtyard confrontation. Not at a police station, not on record in any public sense. A discreet office at Clarence House, 2 royal legal officers, 1 aide taking notes in the corner. The kind of room that exists precisely for situations the palace needs documented, but not disclosed. And Tom arrived without a solicitor, which tells its own story before a word is even spoken. The officers were measured, professional. They started with the straightforward questions. Was the case his? Yes. Were the items in his possession when he arrived? Yes. Had he declined to open it when security requested? Yes. 3 questions, 3 plain answers, no hesitation. And then they asked the one that mattered. Where had the items come from? And Tom looked at the table, not at the officers, not at the aide in the corner. And he said quietly, with what sources describe as deliberate composure, that the items had been kept out of sight for a long time, that someone needed to have them, and that he wasn't prepared to say anything further. And then he stopped talking. The officers waited. The room held that silence for longer than was comfortable, and Tom did not fill it. Now here's the part most tellings of this story skip right over, and I think it's the key to the whole thing. Silence in a room like that is not the absence of an answer. It is an answer. When someone refuses to respond to a direct question, your mind doesn't register a blank space. It fills that space automatically, immediately, with the most plausible explanation available. And in a high-stakes formal setting, a refusal to answer carries a specific weight. It becomes its own kind of statement, not a denial, not a confession, something more durable than either, actually. Because it can't be retracted, it can't be clarified, and it sits there permanently in the record, exactly as it was given. What Tom Parker Bowles said in that room was almost nothing. What the officers heard, and what that aide wrote down, was considerably more. William read the transcript an hour later at Kensington Palace, and read it twice. The confirmed details he set aside, those were already known. What he kept returning to was that one exchange at the center of it. The question about where the items came from. The answer that wasn't an answer. The silence. And that one sentence sitting right before the silence. Someone needed to have them. Which raises, without resolving, a whole set of questions. Who made that determination? When? On what basis? Tom hadn't explained how the items left the archive, hadn't explained how they'd reached him, hadn't named a single other person. But, and this is what the legal officers noted carefully in their summary, in choosing not to name anyone, he'd left a door open. And William had already started walking through it. By 8 the following morning, William had made his first move. He summoned Sir Clive Olden, his father's principal private secretary. And you need to understand who this man is, because it tells you exactly how seriously William was treating this. Sir Clive is a career palace administrator who has spent the better part of 3 decades managing the consequences of things the royal family could not afford to handle publicly. The Sussex departure, the Andrew crisis, several matters that never reached a headline precisely because men like Sir Clive ensured they never needed to. He is not a dramatic figure. He is the exact opposite. A man whose entire value lies in staying calm when nothing around him is. And William's instruction to him was brief. The items recovered from the courtyard were to be treated as stolen royal property. Full formal protocols. But, and this is the part Sir Clive noted carefully, the handling must not look like a cover-up, because the palace's instinct toward silence had backfired too many times in recent memory. Whatever happened next had to be quiet and correct at the same time. William said those 2 things were not negotiable. And Sir Clive asked only one question before leaving the room. He wanted to know whether William had spoken to the king yet. William said he'd call Highgrove before noon. Now the crisis team that assembled by mid-morning ran into a problem so neat and so cruel that the lawyers actually said it out loud. Possession of royal archival material by an unauthorized party is recoverable under existing household protocols. That part is simple. What is not simple is the identity of the unauthorized party. Because Tom Parker Bowles is not a working royal. He carries no formal protection. So pursuing this formally, meant exposing Camilla's son to a process that would, no matter how it ended, attach itself to her name permanently. But sparing him meant the crown had applied its own rules selectively, and selectively, in the current climate, is a story that writes itself. You see the trap. Both paths arrive at the same destination. Neither one is acceptable. And the lawyers said exactly that. So William called Highgrove just before noon, and Charles, who was preparing for a scheduled engagement, listened more than he spoke, which those who know him understand is not passivity. It's the particular weariness of a man who has been navigating versions of this same conversation for most of his adult life, and when his instruction came, it was 5 words: handle it firmly, don't destroy us. And he rang off, and William set the phone down and looked at the legal summary on his desk. 5 words, enough freedom to act, enough weight to feel it. By mid-afternoon, the Royal Collection Trust had been quietly notified. By late afternoon, a formal security review of the archival access log had been commissioned, the first of its kind in over a decade. The machinery had started to move, and here's the thing about machinery like that. Once it's moving, it does not stop simply because the people caught inside it would prefer that it did. The visible changes began within 48 hours, and if you knew where to look, they were unmistakable. The Clarence House security protocol for non-working relatives was quietly updated. Vehicles for private visits would now require 48 hours of advance registration, a requirement that simply hadn't existed the week before. No announcement. One internal email. One updated procedure. The kind of adjustment that's invisible to the outside world and instantly legible to everyone inside. And the staff member who'd been reassigned 6 months earlier, the coordinator whose departure created that 11-day gap, was placed on administrative leave, pending the review. Again, no announcement. The household absorbed it the way households like that one always absorb difficult information, quietly, completely, without visible reaction. And then the review team found the thing that changed the shape of the entire story. Because the access log, once examined in full, did not show one missing entry. It showed 3 separate instances across a 4-month period where items had been checked out of the Diana correspondence collection under a standing authorization code. And the code was valid, procedurally correct. It had been issued as part of the routine administrative transition that followed Charles's accession, a period when dozens of such codes were created, assigned and filed with very little scrutiny, because the sheer volume of work in those months made scrutiny hard to sustain. Nothing about that code had ever tripped a flag. It had been used correctly by every formal measure the system had, and the items logged under it were cataloged identically all 3 times: personal correspondence, miscellaneous, pre-2000, no returns, no follow-ups, no acknowledgement that anything had left and not come back. And then the review team cross-referenced that code against the household staff register. And here's the finding that turns everything. The code did not belong to Tom Parker Bowles. Tom had no archival access. He'd never had archival access. He wasn't a working royal. He had no standing in the formal household structure that would have entitled him to request materials from a protected royal collection under any circumstances at all. The code belonged to a member of Camilla's personal household staff, a senior member. Someone whose access level reflected years of service and a position of real internal trust. And William read that preliminary finding alone. Read it twice, the same way he'd read Tom's transcript. Once for the facts, and once for what the facts implied. And what they implied was this: Tom Parker Bowles had not taken Diana's letters from the archive. He had received them, which means the question was no longer how the items were removed. The question was who removed them, under whose direction, and whether the person whose code appeared 3 times in a log of missing royal correspondence had acted alone. And I want to flag how significant and how deliberate that finding really is, because it reframes Tom entirely. For a few days, the whole palace had been quietly constructing a story in which Tom Parker Bowles was the thief, the man caught with a case he wouldn't open, the man who went silent in a room with 2 legal officers. And then one line in an access log rewrites him. He didn't have the keys. He couldn't have. He was never inside the door. Which means Tom isn't the architect of this at all. He's the delivery. The last, most visible link in a chain that runs backward past him into a household he doesn't even formally belong to. And that's the moment the story stops being about a man and a car, and becomes about a system, about trust, and about who inside that building was willing to spend years of accumulated position to move a dead woman's letters out into the world. Tom carried the case. Somebody else loaded it, and that left one final meeting, and both of the people who needed to be in that room already knew it was coming. William didn't go through the formal scheduling process. He didn't have an aide call Clarence House to find a convenient time. He sent the request directly, a brief message, personal rather than procedural, asking to meet with Camilla at her earliest availability. No explanation, none was needed, and Camilla replied within the hour. She would see him that afternoon. They met in a small sitting room on the ground floor of Clarence House. No aides, no note-taker. Whatever passed between them would stay there, held only by the two people inside it, and sources close to both households described the conversation as short, under 15 minutes, and completely without anger, which is honestly the most telling detail of all. Because anger would have been easier. Anger has a shape, a duration, a natural end. What filled that room instead was something quieter and much harder to resolve. And here's the choice William made that I think reveals exactly who he is. He did not present the access log. He did not lay the review team's findings on the table. He did not walk her through the 3 withdrawal entries and the code that tied them to her household. He deliberately chose not to. Not yet. Because what he wanted from that meeting wasn't a legal reckoning. It was a single answer to a single question, asked directly, without documents, without intermediaries, without the procedural distance institutions build between people when they'd rather not speak plainly. He asked her whether she had known, and Camilla did not answer immediately. She looked at him for a moment in the way people look at someone when they're deciding. Not how much to say, but how to say exactly what they've already decided to say. And her answer, when it came, was not a denial. It was something more complicated than a denial, and much harder to respond to. She told him she had known the letters existed, that she had known they'd been recovered from the storage collection during the cataloging, that she had believed, and continued to believe, right up until the morning in the courtyard, that they would stay where they were, private, secured, inaccessible. Whether she had directed anyone to remove them from the archive, she did not say. Whether she had known they were in Tom's possession, she did not say, and the space between what she confirmed and what she left unconfirmed was precisely the exact width of the question William most needed answered. And I think that's worth pausing on, because it's such a careful non-answer. She didn't lie. She just declined to close the gap. And in a story built entirely on gaps, that's its own kind of information. He sat with her response for a long moment, and then he told her what would happen next. The review findings would go to the king. The procedural reforms already underway would be completed and documented. The Crown's integrity on archival matters could not be seen to make exceptions, regardless of who was involved. And he said all of it without raising his voice, without accusation, in the tone of a man stating institutional facts, because stating them was the only thing left to do. And Camilla asked one thing, that Tom be kept as far from the formal process as possible, and William said he would do what he could. And both of them understood the limits of that, and they left the room separately, and neither of them mentioned Diana by name. Which, when you think about it, is extraordinary. The entire conversation orbited a woman neither of them could bring themselves to say out loud. And the moment that door closed, what had been private began almost immediately to stop being private. It started with a phone call. A reporter from one of the major national newspapers contacted the palace press office late on the 4th evening after the courtyard, and the question he asked was specific, precise enough in its detail about archival access and Clarence House security protocols to confirm that someone on the inside had been talking. Not carelessly, not by accident, with the kind of careful, calibrated specificity that tells you it's a person who knows exactly what they're releasing and exactly how much they're choosing to hold back. And the press office gave its standard line, measured language, neither confirming nor denying. The kind of answer designed to close a conversation that almost every time, instead, opens one. By the following morning, it wasn't the front page, it was page 4, a single column, carefully sourced, describing questions that had arisen around archival access procedures at Clarence House following a security review. No names beyond the institution, no specific allegations, small enough in theory to be overlooked, but specific enough in practice to be impossible for anyone watching this situation to dismiss. And within 12 hours, royal commentators were on camera. Not with facts. Facts were still scarce, still contained inside the households, but with questions. And the public did exactly what the public always does when a royal story arrives, with its most important details missing. It filled the gaps automatically, immediately, in the direction of the most dramatic explanation available. And the conversation fractured along the lines it always fractures along when the palace is involved. One camp read it as institutional failure, an archival system that had proven inadequate, an oversight process that produced a gap wide enough for items to disappear through without a single flag. A second camp read it as something deliberate. Someone inside Camilla's circle had taken Diana's private words, and the palace's response had been to manage the revelation rather than confront what it revealed. And a third camp, quieter than the other two, and in some ways more unsettling, didn't care who took them or how. They wanted to know what was in the letters. What had Diana written in her own hand, in the years before her death, that someone considered worth the enormous risk of pulling from a protected royal archive? And honestly, that's the question that gives this whole thing its gravity, isn't it? International coverage followed within a day. Editorials and publications that don't normally concern themselves with the British monarchy. And the image that circulated most widely wasn't a photograph from the courtyard. It was a file image of Diana's handwriting from a publicly available letter, reproduced legally, and it needed no caption. Her presence was in the story now. It had come in through the side door that private letters always come in through, once they stop being private. And it was not going to leave. And William watched all of it from Kensington Palace, and said nothing publicly. No statement from his press team. His schedule unchanged. He attended 2 engagements that week and smiled in every photograph. And the silence, by that point, was doing exactly what silence in these situations always does. It was speaking for him. 4 days after the coverage broke, the royal family appeared together in public for the first time since the courtyard. A scheduled garden party at Buckingham Palace, one of those fixed summer fixtures you can't cancel without generating its own headline. And the decision to go ahead as planned was itself a decision, because in royal life, there's no such thing as simply showing up. Every appearance is a statement. Every absence is a statement. And if you knew what to look for that afternoon, the whole story was written in the geometry of it. Charles arrived first, then Camilla beside him, then William and Catherine, entering from a separate point in the garden, moving along a route that ran parallel to the King and Queen's path rather than alongside it. And here's what's clever about that, and a little chilling. The two couples moved through the same space, greeted the same guests, smiled for the same photographers, and never once across 2 full hours appeared side by side in the way they had for the previous 2 years. And no single photograph captured that. That was the point. Any individual image showed the royal family functioning exactly as expected, composed, engaged, present. It was only in the sequence, in the accumulated record of who stood where and when and with whom, that the shift became visible. And the correspondents who had spent 4 days on this story had come to that garden party looking for precisely that kind of sequence, and they found it. Tom Parker Bowles wasn't there, which carried no formal significance. Garden parties of that scale don't usually include non-working relatives. But his name was in every notebook in that garden, and his absence was noted by at least 3 correspondents, who understood that in a story about what's missing, everything missing becomes relevant. And then there were 2 small moments that no camera caught, but everyone who mattered heard. Camilla paused in the receiving line beside a former private secretary to Prince Philip, a man who'd spent 4 decades inside the household and understood archival protocol with the quiet authority of someone who helped shape it. The exchange lasted perhaps 40 seconds. She smiled. He bowed. Whatever passed between them was inaudible to everyone nearby, which meant it was available to everyone watching as an image without a caption, the most interpretable kind there is. And on the opposite side of the garden, a guest asked William what he'd been reading lately. Just the kind of light social question garden parties exist to produce. And William answered without hesitation, with the easy, unhurried composure of a man who had decided in advance exactly how he'd move through that afternoon. He said one word: letters. Then he smiled, turned slightly, and moved on to the next guest. 5 seconds. Nobody photographed it, nobody recorded it, but the aide 2 steps behind him heard it, and the correspondent 4 steps to the left heard it too. What the cameras couldn't capture was already written, so how does it actually end? The archival security review concluded 6 weeks after the courtyard. Its findings were not made public. A summary was shared with the king, with William, and with the relevant household principals, the same tight, controlled circulation that had governed every decision since the morning Sergeant Whitmore walked a slow circle around a black car and noticed the boot sat too low. And 3 procedural reforms were implemented. The standing authorization code system was retired entirely. Access to pre-accession archival material now requires dual sign-off from 2 independent household officers. And the coordinator role, vacant since that reassignment 6 months earlier, was formally created as a permanent position, with its own reporting line and its own oversight, making that 11-day gap structurally impossible to repeat. So they closed the hole, after it had already been used 3 times. And Tom Parker Bowles was not charged. No formal criminal process was initiated. The decision, reached by William in consultation with Palace legal counsel and communicated to the king before it was finalized, reflected that impossible arithmetic the lawyers had identified from the very beginning. The Crown's interests were best served by containment. Whether that was justice is a question the decision deliberately did not answer, and Camilla continued in her role. Her public schedule proceeded unchanged. Every engagement attended, every duty fulfilled, every photograph showing a woman who has spent decades navigating the distance between who the public believes her to be and who she understands herself to be, and who learned, across all those decades, how to make that distance invisible. But those who work closely with both households describe, in the months that followed, a quiet recalibration between Clarence House and Kensington Palace. Fewer joint briefings, slightly longer response times on shared scheduling. Nothing that would ever make a headline, everything that would shape a working relationship for years. And here's the detail I keep coming back to, the one that tells you what this was really about for William. He kept Diana's letters. They stayed in the secure safe in his private sitting room, not transferred to the Royal Archives, not catalogued, not formally accessioned into any collection. And he never explained that publicly. Those close to him suggest he simply wasn't ready to hand them back to an institution. They were his mother's private words, and for now, they would stay private. And that, out of everything in this whole story, was the one thing he could still give her. Think about that. He couldn't get justice. Not cleanly. He couldn't punish anyone without wounding his father's wife, and through her, his father. But he could keep his mother's voice out of the machine that she wrote, in her own hand, she never trusted. And that's what he chose. Because what the courtyard actually revealed wasn't simply a breach of archival protocol. It was a reminder of something the monarchy has always known and has never found a comfortable way to say out loud. That institutions are only as trustworthy as the silences they choose to keep. And only as strong as their willingness to examine those silences when the cost of examining them is highest. And Diana had written, in one of the letters William read alone in the lamplight, that the most dangerous thing inside a royal household was never the conflict. It was the silence that settled over a conflict once everyone had decided to pretend it had resolved itself. And she was right. She wrote it in her own hand in 1995. And 30 years later, in a courtyard she never stood in, her words finally found their way back into the light. Because some things get locked away precisely because they are too dangerous to destroy and too honest to be allowed to exist in the open. And the question I'll leave you with is the one nobody in that palace has answered. If Tom only received those letters, then who inside Camilla's household sent them? And what did they think would happen when William opened that boot? Tell me what you think, and if you want to be here when the next piece of this surfaces, subscribe, because a story like this one never really ends where it appears to. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.